Michael Woodhouse. The Honourable Michael Woodhouse.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I move that the Remuneration Authority Members of Parliament Remuneration Amendment Bill be now read a second time. I want to acknowledge and thank the members who have made what I believe are very considered contributions on the bill. And while we will, in due course, be in the Committee of the Whole, where I can respond to some of the more technical questions that have been raised in first reading speeches, I do want to touch on a few of the less technical and background questions and challenges that have been raised. Starting with Mr Young, I think, who made a very, salient point that today is St Patrick's Day. And indeed he quipped that this was a rather Irish thing to do for the Parliament to be legislating for a pay drop relative to what was expected. But I think we all agree that in principle that is the right thing to do. It's just the method and the practice. Now, I acknowledge Mr Hipkins' points where he made the very correct question that if it's okay for MPs to legislate to set aside a pay increase that it believes is too high, what is to stop MPs legislating to set aside a pay increase it believes is too low? Well, the short answer is nothing. The Parliament is the architect of its own destiny. But I would say this, the National Party is a minority party in this Parliament, and it requires for this legislation to pass the support of other parties, which I'm pleased to say, with the exception of the Green Party, and I make no criticism about that because I do understand the principal basis upon which the Greens are opposing this legislation. I'll come back and criticise some of the other comments that have been made by the Green Party, but certainly not its reasons for not supporting it. But I would say to Mr Hipkins, it would be a very brave Parliament and indeed a very brave government that did that. So what we are doing for, I think, a considerable period of time, and I understand that it is incumbent on me as the Minister sponsoring the bill and on this House to make sure that we get the principles as articulated by the Prime Minister's wishes and the Cabinet decision clearly laid out in legislation. Mrs King asked me what was different about the bill as it was prepared last week and which necessitated a slight delay while what I described was a technical amendment was put through. And it was twofold, really. One was a minor mathematical change in the algebra which would have had the transfer of non-cash to cash benefit then subject to the QES uplift, which I didn't believe was appropriate in the circumstances because indeed that was a current year valuation of a change in a non-cash entitlement. And so the algebra was changed to add that part of it, or subtract it as the case may be, back into the calculation of remuneration, salary and super, after QES was applied. The second was a transitional provision between the 2013 determination and the 2015 determination, which would be an issue going forward, but actually manifest in the authority's determination of the calculation of the value of a self-drive vehicle for ministers. Now, ministers have for a very, very long time had access to a self-drive. We can argue and debate whether or not there's how much, or whether there is and how much of a personal benefit there is. But indeed, the authority set a value on that in 2015 that wasn't included in the 2013 determination. It was therefore a tricky transitional provision, which indeed what we've done by addressing that is in the first bill as it was drafted was to remove that altogether from the calculation and simply say this: if an MP is gaining what is perceived to be a personal benefit right now, and the value of that benefit in the authority's estimation is attributed to it or changed, either because of inflation or something else, then that change would not form part of the calculation. On the other hand, if, as is actually the Speaker's prerogative, there has been a reduction in the actual entitlement which has a change in the value, as was the case in the 2015 determination when the when constraints were put on spousal travel, for example, and a reduction in the value of the current, so perceived value of the benefit. When that occurs, and there are very few times now where we've got left actually non-cash benefits, if that occurs in the future, then that needs to be taken into account, but no other change in the value or perceived value of the existing bundle of so-called non-cash benefits, because the authority has pointed out that there may be a private benefit, for example, for cell phones, internet at home, those things that we see as tools to do our job, but the authority is actually talking about attributing a personal benefit value to that. My view is that while that is in existence now, any attribution of future value should not be reducing MP's salary. The formula does that, but you can feel free to check that in the Committee of the Whole. Now, the next issue, in fact, it was raised by both, I think, Mrs. King and Mrs. Martin around the Prime Minister's comments and talking a good game but not doing anything. Well, actually, the Prime Minister's comments did have the effect on the authority of reducing the impact of the increases received through what were quite straitened times. And it's not my usual practice to disagree with one of my colleagues, but Ms. Dowie did make a comment where the Remuneration Authority decided not to heed the advice or the request of the Prime Minister. I'm going to partially defend the authority in that regard, because indeed what they believed they were doing was applying the letter of sections 16 and 18 of the Remuneration Authority Act. And I indeed misread, when I first started thinking about this, the difference between prevailing economic circumstances and countervailing economic circumstances. And what the authority have determined is that there are no countervailing economic circumstances that would warrant a more modest increase in MPs' salaries. But their other role, as set out in that Act, is to achieve and maintain, as I'm quoting from section 18 here, achieve and maintain a fair relativity with the levels of remuneration received elsewhere. And that's where it gets difficult. Where is a relative role? What do we compare ourselves with? And there have been criticisms of runaway rises in executive salaries in the public sector. Well, I don't agree with that. I simply don't agree with that. I'm not going to agree with that, and we're not changing anything in respect of the Remuneration Authority's determinative powers to set salaries for about 80 senior public servants. And indeed, Ms. Fox talked about public sector pay well above that of their ministers. Well, so what? The Commissioner of Police has 12,000 staff, a $1.5 billion budget, an incredibly complex organisation to run. And I've got 7 staff, and I'm a humble minister. True. Is that a valid comparison? Because I don't think it is. I would say that the relativity, and this is a personal view, not the government view, but I do consider that the relativity is actually around seeing the minister as the chairman of the board rather than an executive. We don't do the job, nor should we. We should be nose and fingers out, as good chairs do, not CEOs, because I'm not the CEO of police. Commissioner Bush is. And I think that underscores the difficulty with the question of relativity, that the government has said, you know what, we are paid fairly for what we do now, and the level of increase is inappropriate in the circumstances, and this is the right thing to do. I will, in the Committee of the Whole, address the technical questions around QES, why we have it, what its history is, and indeed Mr Farrer will now be in Hansard because I'm going to address his specific blog, because I think that's important to understand in its broader context. But in the meantime, Mr Speaker, I do appreciate what I have considered to be very intelligent interventions, and I look forward to that continuing.